The wheelchair hit the floor at an angle that made the whole diner flinch. A bump, not an accident. A kick, deliberate, slow. Kind of move a man makes when he wants the room to know he can. 60 people saw it happen. 59 looked away. One didn't. He was sitting in the corner booth with a cup of black coffee going cold and a retired military dog asleep under the table. He hadn't raised his voice in 3 years. Hadn't needed to. When that wheelchair hit the floor and the room went quiet with the specific shame of people choosing not to see something, behind his eyes shifted. Rage. Worse than rage. Clarity. Before we go any further, if stories like this are your thing, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't forget to like, it helps more than you know. Let's go back to Raven Creek, Tennessee. In the morning, everything changed. Raven Creek sat in a fold of the Cumberland foothills, the way old scars sit on skins, quiet, familiar, easy to overlook if you didn't know where to look. It wasn't a dying town exactly. It was a tired one. Kind of place where the hardware store had been on the same corner for 40 years, but the sign had been for the last 12, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it because nobody was sure who owned the building anymore. Main Street still had a diner, a post office, a VFW hall with a cracked parking lot, 3 empty storefronts that used to be a shoe repair, a pharmacy, yes, and something nobody under 45 could remember. Foundry Street ran parallel to Main, block east, quieter, older, with houses that had deep porches and driveways cracked like old pottery. Cole Brennan lived on Foundry Street. He'd bought the corner property 6 years ago, with cash, a modest house attached to a 3-bay garage that he ran as an independent auto repair shop. The sign above the garage bay doors read Brennan's Auto and Small Engine in hand-painted black letters on white. Paint was starting to peel at the edges. Cole kept meaning to repaint it. He hadn't gotten there yet. He was 42 years old, 6'1", and built the way men are built, when hard work is a daily practice rather than a gym goal. His face was weathered in the way that happens to people who spend years in environments that don't care whether they're comfortable, angular jaw, permanent, slight squint, kind of stillness in the eyes that some people read as unfriendly until they understood what it actually was. Watchfulness. Not paranoia, not hostility, the trained, constant, low-grade awareness of a man who had spent years in places where the moment you stopped paying attention was the moment somebody died. He'd been a Navy SEAL for 11 years. He didn't talk about it. Because he was ashamed. Not because the memories were too heavy to carry in conversation. It was simpler than that Cole Brennan had spent more than a decade doing things most people couldn't comprehend, and he'd learned early that explaining it never landed right. Either people romanticized it into something cinematic and false, or they recoiled from the reality of what it actually involved. Neither response was useful, so he kept it quiet, worked on engines, raised his daughter, and let the neighbors assume he was just a mechanic who kept odd hours and didn't come to town meetings. Most days that was enough. His daughter's name was Mia. 9 years old, 4th grade, the kind of kid who asked questions that made adults pause and recalibrate. She had her mother's dark eyes and Cole's jaw and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She also had Ranger, which meant she had a 78-pound Belgian Malinois sleeping at the foot of her bed every night and walking her to the bus stop every morning, and she considered both of these facts to be completely unremarkable. Ranger had been Cole's working dog during his last 2 deployments. He'd been trained for patrol, tracking, and building clearance, the specific, violent vocabulary of military canine work that civilians mostly understood through movies and mostly got wrong. What movies didn't capture was the relationship. Specific intimacy of 2 creatures who had been shot at together, who had learned each other's breathing patterns, who communicated in a language of posture and tension, and the angle of ears that had no words and needed none. When Cole left the Navy, he applied to adopt Ranger through the military working dog program. Paperwork had taken 4 months. Cole had called once a week. Ranger was 7 now, with a slightly graying muzzle and a scar above his left shoulder from an IED that had gone off closer than either of them wanted to remember. Still moved with the precision of a working dog, the controlled, deliberate economy of muscle that never went away, no matter how many years passed. He slept deeply but woke instantly. He didn't bark without reason. He had reasons sometimes. The morning it started was a Tuesday in November, with frost on the windshields and a frothinsome gray sky that threatened something wet, but hadn't committed to it yet. Cole had driven Mia to school early, because she had a project presentation before first bell, and he'd stopped at Patsy's diner on the way back, because his coffee maker had died the previous afternoon, and he'd ordered the wrong replacement part online. No, Ranger rode in the back of the truck's cab and dropped out onto the parking lot with the practiced ease of a dog who had exited military vehicles in environments considerably less welcoming than small-town Tennessee. Patsy's Diner was the kind of place that had been decorated in the early 1990s and had decided that was a defensible aesthetic. Laminate tables, spinning counter stools, a chalkboard menu with 3 items that hadn't changed in a decade. Smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and the specific warmth of a space that had been heating the same room for 40 years. Most of the booths were full by 7:30. The counter stools hosted a row of regulars who had the easy, unhurried posture of people with nowhere to be until they decided to be somewhere. Cole took the back corner booth old habit, exits visible. Wall behind him ordered black coffee and a short stack, pulled out the engine diagnostic report he'd been working through the night before. Ranger settled under the table with a long exhale that sounded like a man finally sitting down after a long shift. He noticed Lena Whitaker when she came in. Not because she was remarkable, though she was because she was navigating. The front door of Patsy's had a push bar that required more lateral force than its designers had considered for someone whose hands were occupied with wheels, and Lena had it handled with the kind of practiced, economical efficiency that comes from doing something difficult so many times it stops registering as an obstacle. She backed through, turned, wheeled herself to the one table, near the window, that had an umpclinch for her chair on both sides. Cole knew who she was the way you knew most people in a town this size, not intimately, but by context. She lived 3 houses down on Foundry Street. She worked remotely, something in graphic design, he thought. She'd moved to Raven Creek about 2 years ago. She kept a kitchen garden along the side of her house and had a covered ramp that had been installed by the previous owner. He'd heard in a way that wasn't quite right. The slope a few degrees steeper than code required, which meant bad days were worse. Thought about mentioning it. He hadn't found the right moment. She ordered coffee and something from the breakfast menu, opened a notebook and began writing. No. On a laptop, an actual notebook, the spiral-bound kind with a pen clipped to the cover. Cole noticed she wrote left-handed and held the pen at an angle that suggested she'd been writing that way since childhood, and nobody had corrected it. Then the door opened again. There were 3 of them. Cole clocked them before the door had finished swinging the specific practiced assessment that wasn't conscious anymore. Just happened the way breathing happened. Weight, gait, posture, hands. 3 men, late 30s to mid-40s. 2 of them large in the sloppy way that comes from being big without ever having been trained. The third shorter, sharper, carrying himself with the practiced ease of someone who'd never been seriously challenged and had confused that for confidence. They were dressed expensively for Raven Creek, the kind of clothes that cost money but were designed to read as casual. The short one had a ring on his right hand that Cole noted without dwelling on. They came in loud. Not violently loud, performatively loud. The volume of men who had learned that claiming space was as simple as filling it with noise. The shorter ones scanned the room, located the accessible table where Lena was sitting, and headed toward it with the unhurried certainty of a man who expected things to move out of his way. He said, stopping beside Lena's table, not a greeting, an address, the kind you use when you're categorizing someone rather than speaking to them. We need this table. Lena looked up from her notebook. He'd intervened. Her expression was calm in a way that Cole recognized the practiced calm of someone who had been managing this kind of interaction for long enough that they'd built a surface for it. "There are open tables near the counter," she said. Her voice was even. "This one works for me because of the clearance." "Table's a table." The short man looked around at his companions with the micro smile of someone morphing for an audience. "We just need it for a bit. I was here first," Lena said. "Appreciate if you'd find another spot." The short man's expression shifted to anger to something colder, the specific look of someone recalibrating from annoyance to intent. "Lady," he said, pulling his voice down into something that tried to sound reasonable and didn't. We're gonna be here for a business meeting. You're having coffee, so maybe think about that." Cole's hand had stopped moving over the diagnostic report. Ranger had lifted his head. At the counter, conversation continued. In the booths, yes, eyes had found interesting things to look at: phones, coffee cups, the middle distance. Particular species of collective unnoticing that happens when a room senses conflict and decides, communally, that seeing it clearly might require a response. Lena closed her notebook. "I don't need to think about it," she said quietly. "I've told you what I need. Please find another table." The short man looked at his right-hand companion, a single glance, the kind that confirms a decision, and then turned back. And then he kicked the wheelchair. Not hard enough to topple it. Precise enough to make the point. The chair jolted sideways. Lena's arm shot out against the table to stabilize herself. Coffee cup tipped, righted, sloshed dark liquid across her notebook. The rear wheel on the right side caught the table leg at an angle, and there was a sharp mechanical sound, something in the wheel assembly, taking stress it wasn't designed to take. The diner went silent. Completely, totally. Specifically silent. Under the table, Ranger rose. Not explosively. No barking, no lunge, no dramatic show of aggression. He simply stood, fully, weight forward. Ears rotated forward, and the low sound that came from his chest wasn't quite a growl. It was the sound that precedes a growl. The sound that experienced handlers called the baseline. The moment before action where the animal is simply communicating the most fundamental fact. I am here. I have made a decision. Respond accordingly. Cole was already standing. He moved with the same absence of drama. No chair scraping back aggressively. No raised voice. No posturing. He walked from the corner booth to where Lena sat with the economy of someone covering ground efficiently. Annis stopped 5 feet from the short man and just stood there. 2 large men looked at him. Cole looked at the short man. Ranger stood at Cole's left leg, weight forward, the low sound continuing beneath the absolute silence of 60 people, finding out what they were made of. The short man opened his mouth, closed it. Cole said nothing. He didn't need to. 11 years of doing what he'd done had stripped away the need to perform threat. He simply occupied space with the specific density of a person who understood exactly what violence looked like and was not afraid of it. Yes, the short man who had built his confidence on people backing down before he had to escalate encountered something he hadn't met before. A person who wasn't calculating odds. A person who had already made his decision and was simply waiting. "Easy," one of the large men said. Not to Cole, to the short man. The short man looked at Ranger, then at Cole, then at the room, which was watching now, not pretending anymore, caught by the specific gravity of a moment that had crystallized into something people would remember. "Let's go," the short man said. Quietly, they left. The door closed. 60 people exhaled. Cole pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and sat down beside Lena without asking, not presuming intimacy, just making himself level rather than looming. "You okay?" he said. "I'm fine," Lena said. A beat later, with the honesty of someone who'd stopped performing composure, "I'm not fine, but I'm not hurt. The wheel took a hit. I heard it." Her jaw was tight. Not from fear, from something controlled and older. "It's been through worse. Mind if I look?" She glanced at him. He could tell she was measuring him not suspiciously, just carefully. The way people who had learned to be careful did. "Cole Brennan," he said. "I live on Foundry, 3 doors up." "I know who you are," she said. Lena Whitaker. I know. He tilted his head toward Ranger. He won't bother you unless you want to pet him. And even then, fair warning, he sheds. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the near miss of one. Go ahead, she said. Look at the wheel. Cole crouched beside the chair and examined the wheel assembly. The hit had bent the rear axle housing slightly, not catastrophic, but enough that the wheel wasn't tracking true, creating a ding that would make self-propulsion exhausting over any distance. He put pressure on the rim in two directions, gauging play. I can fix this, he said. Not here, but it's not complicated. If you can get to my shop, I can have it done in 40 minutes. I can get there, she said, with the particular emphasis of someone who had gotten a lot of places people assumed they couldn't. I didn't doubt it, Cole said. He meant it. Ranger had settled beside Lena's chair while they talked. He wasn't touching, her wasn't pushing for attention, just present. Lena looked down at him for a moment. He was with you, she said. When you came over. He goes where I go. He didn't bark. He doesn't need to, Cole said. She looked at Cole, then really looked, the assessment of one person trying to read another past what they were presenting. You didn't have to do that, she said. Those men, people usually I know, Cole said again. Whitaker, I was here. She turned back to her coffee. Picked up the cup. The hand holding it was completely steady. Cole respected that. He fixed the wheel that morning. Lena wheeled to the garage around 10:00, navigating Foundry Street's cracked sidewalk with practiced efficiency. Cole had the bay door open and a work light set up low. He'd been back from Patsy's for 40 minutes and had already pulled the tools he needed and looked up the specific axle housing for her model chair online. Partly from habit, and partly because going in without the right information was the kind of thing that turned 40-minute jobs into 3-hour ones. He worked and she watched, which he didn't find uncomfortable. Some people talked while he worked. Some didn't. She fell into the second category, which suited him. Mia came home at 3:15 and found a woman she'd never met sitting in the open garage bay with a large dog's head in her lap and her father's legs sticking out from under a workbench. Dad, Mia said, dropping her backpack. There's a dog on a woman. That's Ranger, Cole said, not emerging. The woman is Lena. She's Foundry Street. Hi, Mia said to Lena. Hi, Lena said to Mia. Ranger's tail thumped twice against the concrete. Mia dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead against Ranger's and whispered something to him in the private language she'd developed with the dog over years of shared mornings. And Ranger absorbed this with the stoic dignity of a creature who had been through considerably more demanding things and found that children were, on balance, acceptable. Did someone break your chair? Mia asked Lena. The bluntness of it, no preamble, no softening, just the direct 9-year-old assessment of a situation made Lena blink once. The wheel got damaged, Lena said. How? A beat. Someone kicked it, Lena said. Mia absorbed this the way she absorbed most difficult information quietly, turning it over. On purpose? Yes, why? Mia, Cole said, emerging from under the workbench. I'm asking. I know what you're doing. She doesn't have to answer. Mia said with the gravity of someone who knew the difference. I'm just asking. Lena looked at this child for a moment. Because they wanted the table I was sitting at, she said. And I didn't move. Mia considered this. Were you supposed to move? Lena said. Then why, Mia, Cole said. Help me with the bolts. His daughter made a face that conveyed her opinion of this interruption, but came and held the parts he needed without further commentary. Cole finished the axle housing replacement, tested the wheel tracking, adjusted the pressure until it ran true, and stood up. Roll it, he said. Lena transferred back to the chair and moved it in a circle on the concrete. Drag. She tested it again with a sharp pivot. That's better than it was before, she said. Previous repair was the wrong housing size. Off by about 3 millimeters. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. Whoever did it was close, just not close enough. She looked at him. How much? She said, nothing. Next time something breaks, come back and I'll invoice you. Today's a Tuesday. I wasn't doing anything I couldn't move. She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to argue. Then she let it go. Thank you, she said. Simply. Performance. Don't thank me, Cole said. Ranger's the one who made them reconsider. He was running the day's invoices at 5:30 when the truck pulled into the garage lot. It was expensive. Black, the kind of truck that gets detailed weekly and never actually carries anything in its bed. Parked with the deliberate positioning of a vehicle whose driver expected to be noticed, and the man who stepped out was dressed in the expensively casual way of the three men from the diner, but older, sharper, with the particular ease of someone who had learned to move like he owned whatever room he entered, because usually he did. Grant Hollowell was 51 years old and had the face of a man who had been handsome in his 30s and had aged into something harder, not ugly, but with the jawline and eye set of someone who had spent a decade getting what he wanted through means that weren't always clean. Cole had seen him around, hadn't spoken to him. Hollowell walked through the open bay door without knocking another deliberate move, the kind that announces, "I don't need permission here," and stopped, looking around the garage with the expression of a man doing a quick valuation. Nice setup, Hollowell said. Cole set down his invoice folder. Can I help you? He said. Maybe. Hollowell moved to the workbench, ran a finger along the edge without looking at what he was touching. I'm Grant Hollowell. I do development in the region. Who you are. Hollowell's eyes moved to Cole, measuring, recalibrating. Then you know I've been looking at properties along this stretch. I've heard something about it. I'll be direct. Hollowell reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he set on the workbench. That's a preliminary offer for this property. The garage, the house, the lot. You can have it looked over by whoever you want. I think you'll find it's... Cole picked up the paper, looked at the number, set it down. That's a generous offer, he said. We try to be fair. The reflexive we of a man who had employees but meant himself. The area's going to change over the next few years. Gets ahead of that, everybody wins. I'm not selling, Cole said. A beat. Hollowell's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it did. Maybe sit with it, Hollowell said. Talk to your accountant. Numbers like that. I said I'm not selling, Cole said. Heat. No apology. The flat, absolute clarity of a statement that doesn't require repetition but was being provided as a courtesy. Hollowell looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at the garage. The tools, the invoice folder, the dog who had materialized silently from somewhere in the back of the shop and was sitting 12 feet away, watching. I was reading about the situation at Patsy's this morning, Hollowell said, his voice shifting into the register of a man making conversation. Those men bothering that woman, unfortunate. Cole went still. Visibly, not in any way that Hollowell would see and name. Something behind his eyes shifted with a quiet, total finality, like a door being closed and locked. Reading about it, Raven Creek didn't have a newspaper. The incident at Patsy's hadn't been posted anywhere Cole knew of. It had happened 3 hours ago. Hollowell was watching him. Shame when people get bothered like that, Hollowell said. Makes a person realize how fragile a comfortable situation can be. Cole said nothing. The silence stretched. Hollowell picked up the offer sheet from the workbench, folded it, left it there. Think about it, he said. Offer's good for 2 weeks. He walked back through the open bay door and got into his truck without rushing, the door closing with a solid sound of expensive engineering, and pulled out of the lot with the same deliberate calm he'd arrived with. Cole stood in the empty garage. Ranger had come to stand beside him. Cole reached down and put his hand on the dog's shoulder, not petting, just grounding, and looked at the invoice folder on the workbench and the offer sheet beside it, the empty bay door where Grant Hollowell had just walked out. Fragile, he'd used that word specifically. Cole had spent years in environments where people communicated in layers, where what was said and what was meant were 2 separate frequencies running simultaneously, and reading both at once was the difference between a completed mission and a casualty report. He'd been good at it. One of the better ones, his CO had said, which, coming from that particular man, was the equivalent of anyone else saying exceptional. Picked up the offer sheet, read it again, set it down. Somebody sent those men, he said aloud. Ranger's ear rotated toward him. Cole folded the offer sheet and put it in his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he decided, he was going to find out exactly what Grant Hollowell was building on Foundry Street, and, more importantly, who had been in his way before Cole Brennan had the bad timing to stand up at the wrong diner on the wrong Tuesday morning. Cut the work lights in the bay one by one, walked to the house, made dinner for Mia while she did homework at the kitchen table, watched her eat, read her a chapter from the book she'd picked this month, sat with Ranger on the back porch in the cold while the night settled in over Raven Creek, and thought about the specific weight of the word fragile in a man's mouth, and what it meant that the man who'd used it had known about Patsy's before noon. Stayed on the back porch until the cold got into his knees, which took longer than it used to. Ranger had fallen asleep against his boot, the particular deadweight sleep of a working dog who had decided the threat level was low enough to actually rest, which Cole took as useful data. The dog's instincts were better calibrated than most instruments he'd worked with. If Ranger was sleeping, the night was quiet. If Ranger wasn't sleeping, it was worth asking why. Cole wasn't sleeping. He was running a problem. 11 years of special operations taught him to separate what he knew from what he assumed, because assumptions in his former line of work had a way of becoming obituaries. So he laid it out clean, way his first team leader had drilled into them, during workup facts left. Assumptions right. Keep the columns separate until you have evidence to move something across. Facts. Grant Hollowell had appeared at his garage 3 hours after the incident at Patsy's. Grant Hollowell had referenced the incident directly. Grant Hollowell had used the word fragile in a context that was not accidental. Grant Hollowell had made an offer on a property that was not for sale and had not been publicly listed. Assumptions. The 3 men at the diner had been sent. Lena Whitaker was a target. The offer was a message as much as a transaction. He moved the assumptions one by one to the left column, labeling them working hypotheses, which his team leader had also drilled into them. A hypothesis was something you actively tried to disprove, something you fell in love with because it felt right. Yes, he'd intervened. The moment you fell in love with a theory was the moment the theory started shaping the evidence instead of the other way around. He went inside at 10:40, checked the lock on the front door, checked Mia's window from the hallway, stood in the kitchen for a moment with the lights off, looking at the dark street through the glass. Foundry Street was quiet. A single sodium lamp threw orange light on the cracked sidewalk. 3 houses down, a porch light was on at Lena's. He could see it from here, a warm rectangle in the dark. She'd left it on. He understood that. He started the Morton's the way he'd started most serious work early. Methodical. Mute, without announcement. County Assessor's Office had public records on property transactions going back 30 years, accessible through a state database that was technically available to anyone and practically navigated by almost nobody, because the interface was designed by someone who appeared to hate the concept of usability. Cole had spent 4 years writing and reading operational intelligence reports. He could work the database. He ran Foundry Street first. 14 months. That was how far back the pattern went. Beginning in September of the previous year, a shell company called Meridian Property Holdings LLC had begun acquiring properties along Foundry Street at intervals, spaced carefully enough to avoid triggering any single transaction threshold that would draw attention. Purchases were clean, fair market value, sometimes slightly above, always cash, always through intermediaries. 4 properties in 14 months, a 5th under contract. Cole pulled the LLC registration from the state's business entity database. Meridian Property Holdings filed in Delaware, registered agent a law firm in Nashville, no officers listed by name, beyond what was legally required. He pulled the registered agent's other clients, cross-referenced. Found 2 other LLCs with overlapping registered agents that had been involved in a commercial development project in Chattanooga 3 years earlier. He looked up the Chattanooga project. Grant Salek Grant Hollowell's name was in the third paragraph of a local news article about a mixed-use development that had displaced a block of small businesses in 2021. The article described him as a regional development entrepreneur. The businesses displaced had described him in the comments section beneath the article in less professional terms. Cole sat back from his laptop. He was at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee gone lukewarm and Ranger under the table pressed against his feet, and Mia's backpack by the front door where she'd left it last night, which meant he needed to remind her before school. He'd been a SEAL, not an intelligence analyst, though the line between those roles had blurred considerably over his last 3 years of service, when the team had spent more time doing what they called pattern of life work than direct action. Watching, recording, building a picture of a target's habits, associates, vulnerabilities. The same skills translated cleanly to a county assessor's database and a Google search, which was either depressing or reassuring, depending on how you looked at it. What he had so far was a picture of a man systematically buying his way along a street, block by block, yes, property by property, building toward something that required contiguous ownership, a development footprint large enough to be worth rezoning. He didn't have confirmation of a rezoning application, but he knew where to look. He looked. The Raven Creek Municipal Planning Office posted its upcoming agenda items on a website that appeared to have last been updated aesthetically in 2009. Buried in the November meeting agenda, item 7 of 12, was a line that read, Rezoning Application R2024-9, Foundry Street Corridor, Mixed Commercial Residential, Applicant Meridian Property Holdings LLC. Public comment period. The meeting was in 3 weeks. Cole stared at that line for a long time. 3 weeks. Hollowell had 14 months of preparation and 3 weeks of runway. The remaining property owners on Foundry Street, the ones who hadn't sold, had 3 weeks to understand what was happening and decide what to do about it. And Hollowell knew that, which meant the pressure that had started at Patsy's diner on a Tuesday morning wasn't going to ease. It was going to increase. He closed the laptop and called Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale was 38 years old, a sheriff's deputy in Raven Creek for going on 11 years, and one of approximately 4 people in town Cole considered a genuine acquaintance rather than a neighbor he was polite to. Yes, he'd intervened. They'd met at a veterans event 3 years ago. Marcus had done 2 Army tours in Iraq before coming home to law enforcement and had arrived at the specific friendship that forms between men who have been to similar places and don't need to explain themselves about it. They met at the hardware store's parking lot because Marcus was on patrol and Cole didn't want to wait. And Marcus pulled his cruiser alongside Cole's truck, and they talked through the driver's side windows like people who were used to conversations that didn't require comfortable chairs. Cole laid it out. The diner, Hollowell, the property records, the rezoning application, the timing. Marcus listened without interrupting, which one of the things Cole respected about him, the ability to actually receive information before responding to it. Meridian Holdings, Marcus said when Cole finished. I know of it. We had a noise complaint from one of the Foundry properties last spring. It had been vacant. Then it suddenly had work crews in it at 6A. I ran the ownership, hit the LLC wall, and stopped because it wasn't a criminal matter. It may be connected to one. Marcus looked at him. The diner thing. Those 3 men didn't come in off the highway looking for breakfast, Cole said. They came in looking for a specific table, and Hollowell knew about it before noon. That's a chain of inference, not evidence. I know. What's your ask, Cole? I'm not asking you to do anything unofficial, Cole said. I want to know if there's anything in your records about Lena Whitaker. Anything that connects back to Hollowell's family or associates. There's something there. I don't have it yet. Marcus was quiet for a moment. A car passed on the road. Let me look at some things, he said. Can't promise you anything. I know. And Cole, Marcus put the cruiser in gear. Go at Hollowell directly. The man has lawyers the way other people have socks. You go at him without something solid, you give him the legal handle to pull. Cole nodded. Marcus pulled out of the lot. and Cole sat in his truck for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about what "don't go at him" directly meant in practice. In his former work, going at something directly had sometimes been the job: enter the building, secure the objective, extract. But that had been a different context with a different set of rules and a different kind of accountability. The accountability here was Mia's school in the morning, the garage, Foundry Street, Ranger's gray muzzle in the morning light. He drove home. He didn't decide to include Lena exactly. It happened the way most things happened in a small town, which is to say, organically and without a formal meeting, over the course of 3 days in which Mia started doing homework at Lena's kitchen table after school, because Lena had better internet and a quieter house, and also because Mia had decided Lena was interesting, which was Mia's highest designation and not given lightly. Cole found out about this arrangement on Wednesday when he walked to Lena's at 5:00 to collect his daughter, and Lena answered the door and the smell of something cooking came out of the house behind her, and Mia's voice came from somewhere inside, saying, "Dad, she's teaching me how to read topographic maps," which was not a sentence Cole had anticipated hearing from his 9-year-old on a Wednesday. "Sorry," Lena said, she asked, "for topographic maps." She asked what my notebook was about. I told her I used to do landscape illustration before I transitioned to digital. She wanted to know how to read contour lines. Lena paused. "She picks things up fast." "Yeah," Cole said. "She does." "Dinner's almost ready if you want to come in. It's just soup." He came in. It wasn't just soup, it was something with chicken and white beans and rosemary that had been going in a pot long enough to develop the kind of flavor that doesn't come from shortcuts. Kitchen was organized with the particular precision of a person who had thought carefully about navigation, the most used items within reach from the counter, table positioned for easy approach from 2 sides, everything at a height that worked. Cole noticed this without commenting on it. They ate. Mia talked about topographic maps, and also about a girl in her class who had said something she found philosophically inconsistent, which she explained in detail with the focused intensity of someone who found logical inconsistency genuinely offensive. Lena listened and responded with seriousness that Mia clearly appreciated. Ranger lay under the table and accepted the occasional piece of bread that Mia thought she was being subtle about dropping. After dinner, after Mia had gone to the living room with a book, Cole told Lena what he'd found. He laid it out the same way he'd laid it out for Marcus facts, then working hypotheses, clear labels. Lena sat across the table with a mug in both hands and listened the same way Marcus had, without interrupting, without the nervous interjections people made when they were processing something uncomfortable. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 14 months, she said. Beginning September of last year. She set the mug down. I moved here in January 2 years ago. First trouble started in August last year. Cole waited. Contractor canceled my ramp repair appointment. Didn't give a real reason. I found someone else. He canceled too. Property management company that was supposed to some work on my back wall suddenly couldn't verify my lease documentation, which was absurd because I own the property. She looked at her hands. Thought it was coincidence, or something wrong with how I was presenting myself. I spent 2 months wondering what I was doing to make things difficult. She said the last sentence without self-pity, which made it harder to hear than self-pity would have been. It wasn't you, Cole said. I know that now. Voice was flat. I knew it then, too, in the part of me that wasn't busy second-guessing myself. Knowing something and believing it aren't always the same speed. Cole didn't have anything useful to add to that, so he didn't add anything. I refused him, Lena said. Hollowell. He came to the door himself. Last March. Very polite. Told me the neighborhood was going to change. Told me the offer was generous. Told me I should think about whether this was really the right place for. And he actually stopped himself before finishing that sentence. Had the sense to stop himself. Her jaw tightened slightly. Closed the door in his face. And the problems accelerated after that. Doubled, she said. Within 2 weeks. They sat with that for a moment. I'm not selling, she said. Not to Cole, she wasn't asking for his opinion or his permission. just stating it, the same way he'd stated it to Hollowell in the garage. The flat, absolute clarity of someone who had made a decision and didn't require debate about it. Cole said, "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Right now, keep looking. There's something in the connection between Hollowell and your situation that I haven't found yet." Marcus Hale is looking at his end. She nodded, started to say something. "Stopped. What?" Cole said. "I was going to ask if this was your business," she said. "Then I remembered this morning. It was Ranger," Cole said. The near miss of a smile again, getting closer to actually landing this time. "Ranger," Marcus called on Friday morning. Cole was under a Silverado doing brake work when his phone rang, and he slid out and took the call crouching in the bay, with the phone held slightly away from his ear because he was aware his hands had brake fluid on them, and he only half cared. "I found something," Marcus said. His voice had a quality Cole recognized the flatness of a person containing a reaction. 7 years ago, there was an accident on Route 9 out by the river bridge. Single vehicle, driver lost control and hit the barrier. The other party, the one who got hurt, accepted a settlement about 8 months later. Cole knew from the way Marcus was pacing it that there was more. "The driver of the vehicle that caused the accident," Marcus said. "His name was Derek Caulfield. He pled to a reduced charge, paid a fine, got probation. Jail. And Derek Caulfield is Grant Hollowell's first cousin. And the other party in that accident, the one who took the settlement 7 years ago." Cole was already standing. "Was Lena Whitaker," he said. The silence on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Yeah," Marcus said. Cole pressed his back against the truck and looked at the ceiling of the bay. There was a water stain up there, in the shape of something he'd never bothered to identify. He looked at it. "Marcus, I know, that's not coincidence." "It isn't." Marcus paused. "There's more, Cole. And this is the part where I need you to understand. I'm telling you as a person, and not in any official capacity. Because officially, this is an old, closed case, and I have no jurisdiction to reopen it based on what I have right now. I was one of the first responders that night," Marcus said. 7 years ago. I was 2 years into the job, and I remember the scene. I remember the blood alcohol reading on Derek Caulfield, and it was not the number that appeared in the official report. The number I saw from that preliminary field test, and I know what I saw, Cole, I ran hundreds of those things, was more than twice the legal limit. Close to twice. More than twice. The water stain on the ceiling hadn't moved. And the official report, Cole said, was different, Marcus said. I noticed at the time. I was new. I told myself I must have misread the field test. The machine must have had an error, that the senior officer who filed the report had information I didn't. A pause. I've told myself that for 7 years. Cole said nothing. There was also a witness, Marcus said, a woman who had stopped her car on the shoulder. She spoke to me at the scene. She described what she saw very clearly. She is not in any version of the official file. Her name doesn't appear anywhere. She might as well not have existed. The bay was quiet except for the distant sound of a truck on the highway and the specific industrial silence of a garage at mid-morning. Lena signed a settlement without knowing any of this, Cole said. Whatever she signed based on an official record that may have been materially altered, Marcus said. And the man whose cousin was responsible for her being in that chair, the man whose family may have had influence over what went into that official record, is now trying to take her house. Pushed off from the truck. Marcus, he said, I need you to write down everything you just told me. For anyone. Not yet. Just write it down exactly as you remember it. Date, time, what you saw, what you were told. Every detail. Not asking you to do anything with it. Just preserve it. What's in your head depreciates. What's on paper doesn't. A long pause. Yeah, Marcus said. Okay. And the witness. The woman who stopped. I don't have a name. I remember she drove an older green sedan. I remember she was maybe 60 years old. Marcus stopped. I remember she was frightened. Not of the scene. Of something else. I thought at the time she was just shaken up. Now I'm not sure that's what it was. After he hung up, Cole stood in the bay for 2 full minutes without moving. Ranger watched him from the corner where he'd been sleeping. Dog had learned, over years, used to read the quality of Cole's stillness, the difference between the stillness of a man thinking and the stillness of a man deciding, which were two different things, even though they looked the same from the outside. Ranger stood up. Cole looked at him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." He washed his hands at the bay sink and walked the 3 houses down to Lena's and knocked on the door. She opened it after a moment. Reading glasses pushed up on her head, the kind of expression people had when they'd been interrupted mid-concentration and were deciding whether to be annoyed about it. "We need to talk," Cole said, "about the accident." The annoyance left her face immediately, replaced by something else. Something older. She held the door open. He went in. Told her plainly, without softening the edges, because she had not asked him to protect her from difficult information, and he didn't believe in making that decision for people. He told her what Marcus had found. He told her about Derek Caulfield. He told her about the blood alcohol reading and the missing witness and the possibility that the official record had been altered before she'd signed anything. Lena sat at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time after he finished. The window beside her showed the afternoon light on the side yard, the kitchen garden she kept along the fence, the raised beds she'd built, with the specific dimensions that let her tend them from the chair. Built those beds herself, over the course of a summer, working in sections. "I had an attorney," she said finally, during the settlement. "Someone I found through a referral service. He told me the blood alcohol results were borderline. Case was complicated, that a settlement was the practical choice." Cole held very still. He was very reassuring, she said. He spoke very quickly about the parts that mattered, and very slowly about the parts that didn't. Her voice was completely even. "No. I was 27 years old, and I'd been at a rehabilitation facility for 4 months, and I was so tired of fighting to do things I used to do without thinking. And he sat across from me and told me the practical thing was to settle. And I believed him because I didn't know what I didn't know." Kitchen was quiet. "His name," Cole said. Lena told him. Cole filed it away. Didn't write it down. Yet didn't want to pull out his phone in this moment, in this kitchen. With this woman sitting across from him, with 7 years of something she'd been carrying quietly reorganizing itself in real time into him, something much heavier, now that she knew what it actually weighed. "Are you all right?" he said, which was the wrong question. And he knew it when it came out. But sometimes the right question didn't exist. She looked at him. "I've been all right for 7 years, she said. "I've been making myself all right, because that was what was available." She looked at the garden through the window. "What I am right now is something else." "What?" She turned back to him. And the thing in her eyes was not grief or fear, or the collapse he'd half expected and half dreaded. It was something considerably more dangerous. It was something considerably more dangerous. It was the look for a patient a very long time under the assumption that patience was the only tool available and had just learned there were others. "I want the witness's name," she said. "I want the real blood alcohol number in writing. I want to know who altered that report and who told my attorney what to tell me." She said it the way a person reads a list of materials systematically, without embellishment. "Can you get those things?" "Some of them," Cole said honestly. "All of them?" "Not yet." "What do you need?" He thought about it. "Time, and access to someone who knows the county record system better than I do." "I might know someone," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Retired county clerk," Lena said, "lives on Mill Road. She came to my door the second week I moved here with a jar of preserves and a lot of questions. We've had coffee every few weeks since. She's 81 years old and has a memory like court transcription." She paused. "I don't know what she knows about anything, but if anyone kept records that other people assumed were gone. Can you call her?" Lena was already reaching for her phone. Outside, the afternoon had gone the color of old pewter, the kind of late autumn light that made everything look like it was being seen through water. A car moved slowly down Foundry Street and kept going. The sodium lamp at the corner had come on early, triggered by the cloud cover, throwing its orange light across the cracked sidewalk and the frost that was already beginning to gather in the low places. 3 weeks until the rezoning hearing, and somewhere in this town was a woman with a jar of preserves and an 81-year-old memory and possibly a photocopy of a document that was supposed to have disappeared 7 years ago. Cole sat at Lena's kitchen table and listened to her dial and felt the familiar sensation of a situation that had stopped being one thing and was becoming another. The moment in every operation when the shape of the problem revealed itself fully for the first time, and you understood that what you'd thought was the problem was only the surface, and the actual problem went down and was connected to things that had been buried long before you arrived. He'd felt it dozens of times. He'd learned to trust it. Grant Hollowell had spent 14 months building something he believed was untouchable. Yes, he'd intervened. He'd one mistake. He'd been so focused on what he was building that he'd forgotten to check who was already there and what they'd been carrying quietly in the houses he was trying to take. Her name was Edna Marsh, and she lived in a house on Mill Road that smelled like cedar and old paper and the specific mustiness of a person who had kept things other people threw away. She was 81 years old, small and sharp-eyed, with white hair cut practically short and hands that moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent decades handling documents that mattered. She'd worked for Raven Creek's county administrative office for 33 years before retiring, and she had the particular quality that long-tenured bureaucrats sometimes developed, not the defensive territoriality of someone protecting their turf, but the quiet authority of someone who understood that systems only worked when someone paid attention to them. Decided decades ago, the person would be her. She poured coffee without asking whether they wanted it, set the cups down on the kitchen table with the efficiency of a woman who had conducted thousands of conversations over coffee and knew that offering was a performative waste of time when making accomplished the same thing faster, and sat across from them with her hands flat on the table. Lena told me generally what this is about, she said, looking at Cole with the direct assessments of someone who had no patience for social warm-up. Before we go further, I want to know who you are. Cole Brennan, he said. I live on Foundry Street. I know where you live. I mean who you are. She tilted her head slightly. You're not just a mechanic. I'm exactly a mechanic, Cole said. Currently. She held his gaze for a moment, then made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Fair enough, she said. Currently, she looked at Lena. You want to know about the Caulfield accident file. Lena went still. You know about it. I know about a lot of things, Edna said. She stood, moved to the hallway with the confident navigation of someone who knew exactly where everything was in her own house, and came back carrying a manila folder that had been inside a larger accordion file that she set on the counter before bringing just the folder to the table. She placed it between them without opening it. I want to tell you why I kept this before you look at it. All right, Cole said. Edna sat back down. She looked at her coffee cup rather than at them in the way of someone who was organizing something that had been in storage for a long time and needed a moment to bring it out in the right order. The accident was on a Friday night in October, she said. Derek Caulfield was the driver. I didn't know him personally, but I knew who he was because in a town this size you know who people's cousins are. A week after the accident, I received a request internal through the county administrative system to pull the physical file on the responding officer's incident documentation and route it to a specific office within the county sheriff's department for administrative review. She made quotation marks with her voice, not her fingers. This was not an unusual process. Incident files got reviewed for various reasons. She stopped, but Cole said, but the request had been processed in a way that skipped a step. Specific logging step. When files were routed for administrative review, they were supposed to be logged in the outgoing register before transfer. This file was not logged, which meant if anyone looked for it later, the official trail showed it had never moved. But it was no longer where files at that stage were supposed to be. Kitchen was quiet. I noticed because it was my job to notice, Edna said. And because I had learned over 20 years that the things people forget to log are usually the things they most want to be unlogged. She tapped the folder. Before I routed it, I made a copy. I put the copy in my personal files, which were not county property and were not subject to administrative review. I have moved 4 times since then. It has been in a box in whatever closet was most convenient, and I have thought about it, on average perhaps once a month, for 7 years. Yes, he'd intervened. Lena was looking at the folder the way people looked at things they had not known they needed until the moment they were in front of them. "Why didn't you come forward?" Cole asked. Not accusatory, genuine. Edna looked at him. "Because I had no evidence a crime had been committed. A filing irregularity is not a crime. A file that was routed without being logged is not a crime. I had a copy of a document that the county had the original of, and the original was still accessible, and if the two were identical, then I had nothing." They were not identical, she stopped. I would have needed to explain how I knew they weren't identical. And at that point, I was 54 years old, with 11 years left until retirement, and it's explaining what I had done and why would have involved things I was not prepared to involve myself in. Cole nodded. He didn't like it. He understood it. "And now?" Lena said quietly. "I'm 81, Edna said. And retired, and you're sitting in my kitchen." She pushed the folder toward Lena. The photocopy was 11 pages. "Yes," intervened. Lena spread them on the table, and she and Cole read them in the specific silence of people encountering something that was confirming what they'd feared, rather than telling them something new, which was in some ways worse. The field sobriety documentation in Edna's copy listed a preliminary breath test result of 0.19. The legal limit in Tennessee was 0.08. It was not borderline. It was not complicated. It was more than twice the legal limit, unambiguously, and the officer who had administered the test had signed his name beneath the result. Cole recognized the officer's name. He'd heard it from Marcus. Kept his face neutral and kept reading. The witness statement was on page 7. A woman named Dolores Van, aged 58 at the time, provided a written statement to the respondent describing what she had seen from her vehicle on the shoulder of Route 9, the Caulfield vehicle crossing the center line at speed before impact, the driver having difficulty with basic motor function when he exited the car before officers arrived. The statement was detailed, specific, and signed. It was in Edna's copy. It was not, Marcus had told him, in any version of the official file that currently existed. Neither was the 0.19 reading. The number in the official record, which Lena's attorney had used to characterize the case as complicated, was 0.07, 1 point below the legal limit, technically sober by the definition of the law. Lena set page 7 down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust your hands. "He wasn't borderline," she said. "My attorney told me he was borderline." Cole said nothing. "He told me the blood alcohol was borderline. That a jury might not convict, that the settlement was the practical." She stopped, pressed her fingers flat on the table. He used that word. Practical. He said it was the practical choice. "He may have been working from the altered file," Cole said. "Or he may have been told what to tell you. Does it matter?" He thought about it honestly. "For what you do next, yes. It matters who knew what." Lena nodded slowly, the mechanical nod of someone filing information they'll process later, because processing it now would take them somewhere they can't afford to go in this kitchen, at this table, in front of these people. Edna had been watching Lena with the still, unsentimental attention of a woman who had seen difficult things and knew that sympathy, offered wrong, used to, became an obstacle. "So, what do you need from me?" Edna said. "Can we make copies of these?" Cole said. "Those are the copies. You can take them." She looked at Cole directly. "Question is what you do with them, because a photocopy made by a county clerk who didn't log what she was doing isn't evidence in a court of law without context." Cole said, "But it's a starting point, and starting points are what I need right now." "There's one more thing," Edna said. She had not touched her coffee since she'd sat back down. "Dolores Van, the witness, I don't know if she's still alive. She was from Creston County, I remember. because her address was out of district, and I noted it at the time. If she's alive and she still remembers, her testimony combined with this document, Cole said, would be something considerably harder to dismiss than a filing irregularity. Edna finished. Lena gathered the pages. Her hands were steady. Cole watched her do it, the deliberate, organized way she stacked and aligned them, and saw in it the same quality he'd seen at Patsy's when she'd held the coffee cup without trembling. The control wasn't absence of feeling. It was the architectural decision to feel it later when there was room. They left Edna's house at 4:30 with the folder under Cole's arm and the specific weight of a story that had been incomplete for 7 years and was now, for the first time, showing its actual shape. Pressure from Hollowell's side arrived 4 days later from 2 directions simultaneously. Cole, the man, had been watching and had decided the timeline needed acceleration. Cole got his first a certified letter from a city licensing office citing 3 violations of the Municipal Commercial Operation Code, 2 of which related to signage requirements and 1 of which concerned the drainage system on the garage property. The violations were not fabricated entirely. The sign had peeling paint, which could technically be cited, and the drainage had been on his maintenance list for a year. But they had not been cited in 6 years of operation, and the specific timing of their sudden enforcement required no imagination to interpret. He called the licensing office, was told the inspection had been triggered by an anonymous complaint, was given a compliance deadline of 14 days. He put the letter on the workbench and went back under the truck he'd been working on. Lena's arrived the same afternoon. It was from the county building office requiring a structural assessment of her property based on a reported concern about the integrity of the load-bearing elements of her rear addition. The assessment had to be conducted by a licensed inspector of the county's choosing. Cost was her responsibility. If the assessment found deficiencies, she would be given 30 days to remediate or face an occupancy restriction. She called Cole. Same day, she said when he picked up. Same day, he confirmed. He knows we've been talking. Or he's just tightening the timeline across the board. 3 weeks to the hearing. He wants people rattled, not organized. Is it working? Cole looked at the compliance letter on the workbench. 14 days to fix a sign and a drainage system that he could address in a weekend, if he chose to spend the weekend that way. The point wasn't the violations. The point was the message we can reach into your operation whenever we choose. We can make the machinery of compliance into an instrument. We can make your life administratively exhausting until selling becomes easier than fighting. He's trying, Cole said. What do I do about the inspection? Refuse it. That gives them the occupancy lever. Let it happen. But call your own inspector first, someone not on the county's list, and have them walk the property today or tomorrow. You want an independent baseline before their person sets foot on it. Pause. You know a structural inspector? I know a retired one, Cole said. He owes me a transmission. He called in the transmission debt that afternoon. The retired inspector, a man named Walt Greer, who was 70 years old, and had the disposition of someone who had spent a career finding problems in buildings and had transferred that same skeptical eye to most other aspects of existence, walked Lena's property Thursday morning and gave his verbal assessment with the economy of a man who had been paid by the word in exactly 0 contracts. Addition's fine, Walt said, standing in Lena's backyard with his hands in his jacket pockets. Rear walls got some settling, normal for a house this age. Nothing structural. Whoever called this in either doesn't know what they're looking at or knows exactly what they're looking at. Second one, Cole said. Walt looked at him. Yeah, that's what I figured. He looked at the house. Get me a written request, and I'll put the assessment on paper. Raw, notarized, dated today. If their inspector comes in with a different story, you've got something to sit next to it. That was Thursday. Friday before dawn, Ranger woke Cole. With a bark he hadn't barked, Cole would have heard it from across the hall. He woke him the way the dog woke him when something was wrong, but not immediately dangerous, a specific pressure against the side of the bed, a low sound just barely above the threshold of hearing, the canine equivalent of hay. Cole was out of bed before his eyes had fully adjusted, moving on the automatic muscle memory of someone who had woken in worse conditions to worse sounds for years. He put his hand on Ranger's shoulder. The dog was oriented toward the front of the house. Inside. Outside. Cole pulled on pants and boots without laces and moved to the front window, staying to one side of it, another habit that had never left. The understanding that standing in front of a lit window was an invitation of a specific kind. He looked out at the angle the position allowed. The street was dark. The sodium lamp at the corner was on. Nothing moved. Ranger pressed forward slightly, the low sound continuing. Cole moved to the front door and opened it, without turning on the porch light. Cold came in immediately, well below freezing, the kind of cold that arrived in Raven Creek in late November and committed to it. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust, from even the low light inside, to the dark outside. He'd learned to stand in doorways in environments considerably less quiet than this one. He looked at Lena's house. Her porch light was on, as always. But something was wrong with the near side of her property. He could see it from here, a shape that wasn't right. Something about the way the light hit the driveway near the front of her house. "Stay," he told Ranger. He went across the street in the dark, moving on the sidewalk, watching the perimeter of Lena's property as he approached. Movement. No vehicle on the street, except the ones that lived there. The footprints were the first thing he registered clearly, 2 sets in the frost that had gathered on the lawn, coming from the street, his fans moving toward the house, then back. He saw a deliberate path, not a wanderer, someone who knew exactly where they were going. The wheelchair had been left at the end of the ramp. Lena left it there, sometimes just inside the covered area, out of weather, ready for morning. Cole crouched beside the rear wheel. The tire had been punctured. Slashed, a single deliberate perforation. A nail or a sharp implement inserted and withdrawn. Kind of damage that would hold air long enough to not be immediately obvious, then fail, gradually failing, worst precisely when it was most needed, at the start of a day's first movement. He stood up and looked at the street. Footprints tracked to the curb at a point between 2 streetlights in the darkest section of the block. Ranger was already at the front door. When Cole looked back, he'd followed despite the command, which was unusual enough that Cole noted it without saying anything. The dog moved to the footprints and dropped his nose and tracked them to the curb in 8 seconds, then lifted his head and turned in a tight circle and sat. Vehicle had been there. Gone. Cole looked at the house. He didn't want to ring the bell at 4:30 in the morning. He also was not going to walk away and leave her with a wheel she didn't know was compromised. He rang the bell. It took 3 minutes. Then the interior light came on, and Lena opened the door with the specific expression of someone who had been awake already, not groggy, not startled. Alert. Already dressed in the way of someone who had been lying on top of the covers rather than under them. "The rear wheel," Cole said. She looked at the wheelchair, then at him. "Someone punctured it," he said. "Overnight. Probably 2 to 3 hours ago, based on the frost on the footprints." She said nothing. It came from the street. 2 people based on the prints. Parked between the lights, in and out in under 4 minutes, probably less. Lena moved past him and looked at the tire. She touched the wheel rim. Then she sat very still in the cold and didn't say anything for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. "They came onto my property," she said. "Yes, in the night." "Yes." She turned and looked at the street. Her face was unreadable in the specific way of someone who was reading many things at once and had locked the external display while they processed it. "This is different," she said. "Yes." Cole crouched beside the tire again, already pulling the small repair kit from his jacket pocket. He'd grabbed it on his way out. The habit of a person who thought forward. "This is escalation. They're not filing complaints anymore. They're on your property. Can Marcus do anything? I'm going to call him at a reasonable hour and tell him what I found. Whether that becomes an official report depends on whether we want to tip Hollowell that we're documenting things." He looked up at her. "That's your call." She thought about it. The cold was significant at this hour, and neither of them acknowledged it. "Document it," she said. Everything. The prints, the tire, the time. I want it on record that his people were on my property. His people. Don't tell me it wasn't, she said. Aggressive. Just tired of the pretense of ambiguity. I won't, Cole said. He fixed the tire while Ranger sat beside Lena's chair, pressed against it slightly, performing comfort but providing it in the way the dog had always provided it, through proximity and the specific warmth of a creature that had decided where it stood. Lena's hand was on the dog's shoulder. Cole worked and didn't comment on it. When he was done, he took photographs of the footprints with his phone, measuring them against his hand for scale. He photographed the puncture before he'd repaired it. He walked the perimeter of the property and photographed the complete track. Then he stood at the curb and photographed the gap between streetlights where the vehicle had parked. Watched him work. You do that like you've done it before, she said. Different context, Cole said. Same method. What context? He glanced at her. She was asking because she'd been awake for hours thinking, and talking to him steadied it. He understood that. Site exploitation, he said. You go into a location. You document everything that tells you something before you touch it. Weapons, documents, personnel, entry and exit points. You're building a picture of what happened before you arrived. He pocketed his phone. Same thing here. The footprints tell me how many. Puncture method tells me it was deliberate and skilled, not a random act. Somebody who knows what they're doing. The vehicle position tells me they had a driver waiting, which means at least 3 people. Organized. Organized, she repeated. This isn't somebody being impulsive, Cole said. This is a managed operation. She absorbed that. He's scared, she said. Cole looked at her. If he's doing this now, he's scared, she said. He wouldn't risk this level of exposure if the rezoning was as secure as he wants people to think. Cole said nothing, but he thought she was right. Fear wasn't always about weakness. Sometimes it was about the specific recognition of a threat, and Hollowell was too smart not to have recognized that the situation on Foundry Street had changed. What Cole had found. He didn't know about Edna Marsh or the photocopy, or Marcus's account of the field sobriety reading from 7 years ago. But he could feel the shift in temperature, even if he couldn't identify its source. And the proximation was what scared people did when they could feel the ground moving, without knowing how. Go back inside, Cole said. It's cold. You're not going home? He looked at the street, the sodium lamp, the frost-covered grass. The darkness between the lights where a vehicle had idled, while 2 people walked onto a woman's property in the night and put a nail in her wheel and walked back. Yet, he said. He sat on Lena's porch steps in the cold with Ranger beside him until the sky in the east started going from black to the specific dark gray that preceded gray, and then the slow pale blue that was a Tennessee winter morning arriving without ceremony. Warmth, and nothing moved on Foundry Street, and after a while, Lena opened the door and handed him a thermos of coffee, and went back inside without saying anything, and he sat with it for another 30 minutes. Marcus came by mid-morning and walked the scene, without Cole having to explain the methodology. It was a sheriff's deputy. He knew what footprint documentation looked like, and he looked at Cole's photographs with the careful eye of a man who was also doing the math on what could be taken to a supervisor and what couldn't. I can file it, Marcus said, as a report of trespassing and property damage. But you understand where it goes from there. Nowhere fast, Cole said. At Hollowell's pace of political connection, somewhere slow, specifically. Marcus handed the phone back. It's on record, which is what she wants. She's right to want it. Marcus looked at the curb. 3 people minimum. Professional entry. And out before 3 a.m. He shook his head slightly. This isn't local boys doing a favor. This is contracted. Cole. Marcus turned to face him directly. I spoke with someone at the state attorney's office. No. Off the record. Exploratory. About the accident file discrepancy. Cole went very still. They were interested, Marcus said. Committed, not acting. Interested. The distinction matters. Interested means they want to know if there's something there, not that they've decided there is. But I was told off the record that if a credible supporting document existed, combined with a law enforcement witness who was willing to provide a formal account of the discrepancy between the field tent and the official record. What did they say? Marcus was quiet for a moment. The morning had a specific quality, cold and clear and still, the kind of morning that made sound carry. They said it would be something they couldn't ignore, he said. Cole looked at the street. The photocopy was in a locked box in his garage. Edna Marsh was on Mill Road with her cedar-smelling house and 33 years of knowing how county administrative systems worked. Marcus was standing in front of him with the specific look of a man who had spent 7 years telling himself he'd misread a field sobriety test and had run out of belief in that particular story. And somewhere in Creston County, if she was still alive, a woman named Dolores Van had stopped her car on the shoulder of Route 9 on a Friday night 7 years ago and seen exactly what she'd seen, and then written it down. Intervened, and then had her name removed from the official account of it, and had been living with whatever that meant ever since. 3 weeks to the rezoning hearing, and the story that had been buried under under the entire apparatus of Hollowell's carefully constructed 14-month campaign was not staying buried. It was moving. Cole could feel it the way he'd felt operations shift in the field, the specific change in the quality of a situation when all the pieces were in motion and the outcome was no longer about preparation, only about what happened when the moving pieces collided. He'd learned to recognize that feeling without getting ahead of it, because the worst thing you could do when things started moving was start assuming you knew where they'd land. You kept your footing. You stayed with what you knew. You let it develop. He went back to the garage. He sanded the sign above the bay doors in the afternoon, both because the compliance letter required it, and because it gave him something physical to do with his hands, while his mind worked the problem. Mia came home from school at 3:15 and stood in the driveway looking up at him on the ladder. "You're painting the sign?" "Fixing the paint. It looks the same. It'll look different when I'm done." She considered this with the philosophical skepticism of a 9-year-old who had inherited her father's tendency to question assertions that hadn't been proved. She said, "Is Lena okay?" He kept sanding. "What makes you ask?" "She seemed different today when I went by. Like when you seem like you're listening, but you're actually thinking about something else." Stopped sanding, looked down at his daughter standing in the driveway with her backpack and her dark eyes, and the specific, unsettling perception of a child who had grown up watching a man navigate things he didn't explain. "She's dealing with something hard," he said, "but she's okay. Thought about this. Are you helping?" "Trying to." She nodded as if this were a satisfactory and complete answer, and went inside. Cole went back to sanding. The sign took 2 hours. When he was done, and the fresh paint was drying in the cold air, he stood back and looked at it, Brennan's auto and small engine in clean black on white, visible from the street, compliant with municipal signage regulations, unremarkable in every way that the licensing office cared about. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside to make dinner. Was at the stove when his phone rang. Number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. Something made him answer, "Mister." A woman's voice. Older. Careful. "Yes. My name is Dolores Van." A pause as if she was testing the weight of what came next. "I think you've been looking for me." The kitchen went completely quiet, except for the sound of something in the pan that needed attention, which Cole turned off without looking away from the wall in front of him. "Mrs. Van," he said. "Yes, I have been. I heard from someone in Raven Creek that someone was asking about the accident on Route 9. October 7 years ago." Her voice was steady, but had the quality of someone who had rehearsed this and was working to stay in the prepared version, rather than the version where she said what she actually felt. "I want to know who you are and why you're asking." "My name is Cole Brennan," he said. "I live on Foundry Street in Raven Creek. I'm asking because the woman who was hurt in that accident lives 3 houses away from me, and the man whose cousin was driving the car that night is currently trying to take her home." Silence. Long silent that woman. "Is she? How is she?" "She's strong," Cole said. "She's been handling it alone. She doesn't have to anymore." Another pause. When Dolores Van spoke again, her voice had changed, not broken, opened slightly, the way a door opened when the person behind it had finally decided to stop holding it shut. I gave a statement that night, she said. I told the officer everything I saw. He wrote it down. I signed it. She stopped. And then I waited to be called. To testify. To tell someone officially what I'd seen. Her voice was very quiet now. Ever called. Cole stood in his kitchen with the dead phone call that had just been answered and the turned-off stove and the sound of Mia doing something in the next room. Mrs. Van, he said, would you be willing to tell it again? The silence this time was shorter. Yes, she said. I've been willing for 7 years. I just didn't know who to tell it to. Called Marcus that night. Not at a reasonable hour, it was 9:47, and Marcus was off shift, and Cole called anyway because the window on this thing had just changed shape, and Marcus needed to know it. Marcus picked up on the second ring, which told Cole he hadn't been sleeping either. Dolores Van, Cole said. She's alive. She's in Creston County. She gave a statement the night of the accident that described Derek Caulfield's impairment in specific detail. She signed it, and she never heard from anyone again. A long pause. She's willing to talk, Cole said. Formally. To whoever needs to hear it. Cole. Marcus's voice had the quality of someone sitting down somewhere. Do you understand what you're saying? A surviving eyewitness whose statement was removed from the official record, combined with a photocopy showing a blood alcohol reading that doesn't match the filed report, combined with a first responding officer who is prepared to state on record that the field test result he observed was materially different from the one that appeared in documentations. I understand what I'm saying. This isn't a civil matter anymore. This is potential criminal falsification of an official law enforcement document. This is Cole. This goes above my head. This goes well above my head. Who do you call? A pause. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has a division that handles law enforcement and conduct. I have a contact there. Someone I went through a training program with 3 years ago. She's straight, I'd stake something on it. Call her tonight. It's almost 10, Marcus. Another pause. Then, yeah. Okay, tonight. Cole hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet. Mia had gone to sleep an hour ago. Ranger was in her room. The garage outside was dark. The sign above the bay doors was dry now, the black letters clean against the white. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon and didn't drink it. Just set it on the counter and looked at it. The problem with setting something in motion was that it moved in directions you didn't entirely control. He'd been managing the variables carefully, what Marcus knew, what Edna had, what Dolores Vins was willing to keep them separate until he had a clearer picture of how need to be assembled. They were converging faster than he'd planned because Dolores Van had called him, which meant someone in Raven Creek had talked, and the information was moving in more directions than he'd tracked. He needed to tell Lena, not tomorrow, tonight. He called her. She picked up quickly. I have something, he said. Significant. Are you up? I'm up, she said. Come over. He told her about Dolores Van, the same way he'd told her about the accident file, plainly, in sequence, without smoothing the edges. Lena sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug she wasn't drinking from and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set the mug down. She's been waiting 7 years for someone to call, Lena said. Yes, because someone removed her from the file and nobody followed up, and she didn't know what to do with what she'd seen. That's what she said. Lena was quiet. The kitchen window was dark, just her reflection, and coals in the glass, and outside the cold was deep and settled. I want to talk to her, Lena said. Cole had expected this. He'd also thought about whether it was a good idea. The practical, tactical part of his brain that organized information into columns and assessed exposure and vulnerability had flagged it as a variable that could be unpredictable. But the part of him that had been watching Lena Whitaker for the past 2 weeks, carrying 7 years of quietly managed reality, handling each new piece of information with the steady architecture of someone who had learned to be strong because the alternative wasn't available. That part didn't think it was his decision to make. I'll set it up, he said. She looked at him. He thought about whether to let me. For about 4 seconds, he said honestly. And it's not my call. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, and he could see something in her settle, not relief exactly, but the specific ease of a person who had expected to have to argue for something, and didn't. The TBI contact, Lena said. Marcus's person. What happens when they get involved? Stops being something we manage and starts being something they manage. We become witnesses and supporting parties, not investigators. Cole leaned back in his chair. Which is how it should work. I'm a mechanic with a deceased career in special operations and a good dog. A law enforcement officer. You've been operating like one. I've been doing what was available to do, Cole said. Which is different. She thought about that. Is there a risk? If the TBI gets involved, does Hollowell find out before we're ready? There's always a risk, Cole said. But Marcus's contact is an investigator. How to move without tipping targets. And Hollowell's operation has its own exposure. Now, he had people on your property. He's using his position in the county to drive licensing action against a small business. The moment any of this gets formal scrutiny, his leverage flips. I don't know. Days maybe. A week. I don't control that timeline. Looked at the window. Her reflection looked back. The rezoning hearing is in 17 days, she said. If the investigation doesn't move fast enough, we show up at the hearing with what we have, and we make the case through the public comment process, Cole said. The investigation and the hearing aren't the same fight. We can run both. She turned back to him. You've done this before. I don't mean this specifically. I mean run two things at once under pressure. He thought about how to answer that. Different circumstances. Same general shape. She didn't push it. Yes, she'd learned over the past 2 weeks when to push and when to take what he offered, and he'd learned the same about her. And the specific efficiency of that mutual calibration was something he noticed without quite having words for. Okay, she said. Talk to Marcus. Set up the call with Dolores Van. She stopped. What? Thank you. I keep saying that, and it keeps sounding insufficient. You don't have to say it at all, he said. I know. I'm saying it anyway. He walked home in the cold. Ranger was waiting at the front door, had somehow relocated from Mia's room in the time Cole had been gone, a feat of quiet canine logistics that Cole had stopped questioning years ago. Good, Cole said. Ranger's tail moved once. Cole locked the door. TBI contact's name was Special Agent Carol Breyer, and she called Cole directly at 8:15 the following morning, which meant Marcus had reached her, and she had decided to move fast enough that waiting until business hours was not her priority. She was direct in the way of someone who had learned that directness was faster and more ethical than the alternative. Deputy Hale briefed me on the situation, she said. Looked at the public record on the Caulfield accident. I want to hear what you have, in your own words, and I want you to understand, before you start, that anything you tell me may be relevant to a formal investigation. I'm not recording this conversation, but I may contact you again formally. Are you comfortable with that? Yes, Cole said. He told her. All of it, in sequence, hit the same way he'd briefed intelligence to senior officers BLUF first, bottom line up front, then supporting detail in chronological order. Marcus had observed the night of the accident. What Edna Marsh's photocopy showed, what Dolores Van had told him, the property acquisition pattern, the parallel pressure campaign against Lena and his garage. Breyer listened without interrupting. He could hear her writing. When he finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Photocopy, she said. Where is it? Locked in my garage. Going to need you to not move it, not copy it further, and not discuss it with anyone you haven't already discussed it with. Can you do that? Yes. The witness, Dolores Van. How did she contact you? Phone. Last night. She said someone in Raven Creek told her someone was asking about the accident. Do you know who told her? No. I've been careful about who I've spoken to. Information moves in small towns without your help, Breyer said. It wasn't a criticism, just a statement of operational reality that Cole recognized. He said, I need to speak to Mrs. Van directly. and to Deputy Hale formally, which is going to require some navigation on my end, because he's active law enforcement and there's a process. She paused. Property acquisition pattern and the pressure campaign that's potentially a separate matter from the falsified document, but they may connect to the same people. I want to be clear that I can't make promises about timelines or outcomes. I'm not asking for promises, Cole said. I'm telling you what's there. Short silence. Mr. Brennan, Breyer said. Deputy Hale told me you were a SEAL. Former. He said, if you tell me the picture looks like something, the picture probably looks like something. Cole said nothing. I'm inclined to agree with his assessment, Breyer said. I'll be in contact. She hung up. Cole set his phone on the workbench and looked at the garage. The first appointment of the day was a Jeep Cherokee coming in at 9 for a coolant leak. The compliance deadline on the licensing violations was in 12 days. The rezoning hearing was in 16. He got the Jeep up on the lift. Story broke 11 days later. Through the TBI investigations moved at institutional speed, and Breyer had been clear formal action would take longer than the hearing timeline. Broke through a reporter named Janet Okafor, who covered regional development and municipal governance for the Tennessee Courier, the largest newspaper in the state's middle region, it turned following Grant Hollowell's development activities for 8 months on a separate thread that had not yet had enough to publish. Lena had found her. Cole didn't know the full story of how he knew that Lena had spent 3 evenings making phone calls he wasn't part of, working a network of contacts from her former professional life in Nashville that included people who knew who was following what. He knew that Lena had prepared a document organized, sourced, careful that laid out the Foundry Street acquisition pattern, rezoning application, the parallel pressure campaign in terms that a journalist could verify independently. He knew that Lena had decided at some point in those 3 evenings of phone calls to stop waiting for someone else to carry this into the light. He found out about Janet Okafor on a Tuesday evening when Lena called and said, "A reporter from the Courier is coming to Raven Creek on Thursday. She wants to talk to you." Cole was quiet for a moment. "How much does she have?" he said. "Enough to publish something." "Everything. She needs the photocopy corroborated. She can't use Edna's document directly without a second source on the content. And she wants to talk to someone who can speak to the pressure campaign from the business side." "That's me. That's you," Lena said. "You don't have to." Yes, he thought about the licensing letter on the workbench. 2 weeks deadline that had been, in its own way, a message. The footprints in the frost at 4:30 in the morning. "Yes, I do," he said. No. Janet Okafor was 34 years old, compact and precise, with a recorder she asked permission to use and a notebook she used regardless. And she interviewed Cole in the garage on Thursday morning with the kind of focused, performative attention that told him she was after accuracy rather than narrative color. She asked good questions, specific, chronological, and when he gave her an answer, she tested it from a different angle before moving on. "Your military background," she said at one point. "Relevant," Cole said. She looked at him. "It establishes why you notice things other people might not have." "I noticed them because I was paying attention," he said. Anybody paying attention would have noticed them. People weren't. She wrote that down. She interviewed Lena for 2 hours in Lena's kitchen. She spoke to Edna Marsh by phone. She contacted Dolores Van independently, which meant Van had now told her account to 3 separate people in the space of 2 weeks after 7 years of telling it to no one. And Cole thought about what that must feel like, the specific release of a story that had been held too long. The article was scheduled to publish the morning of the rezoning hearing. Cole found out the date from Lena, who'd been in contact with Okafor daily. He sat with that information for a while. The timing was not accidental. Okafor understood that the hearing was the pressure point, that the story landing the morning of gave it maximum impact on the public comment process, that local residents walking into Municipal Hall, having read what was in that article, would walk in differently than they would have otherwise. Yes, It was a sound strategic decision. It was also the kind of decision that would be visible to Hollowell the moment the paper hit, and Hollowell would spend the hours before the hearing doing everything he could to contain it. Cole told Marcus. Marcus told Breyer. Breyer called Cole back within 2 hours. The article is going to accelerate things on our end, she said, in ways I can discuss. I'm telling you to be aware that the next 72 hours may be unpredictable. Understood, Cole said. Is the photocopy still secure? Yes, keep it that way. If anyone, and I mean anyone, contacts you asking for it before you hear from me directly, you call me immediately. Who would contact me? A pause. People who would prefer it didn't exist, she said. Before the hearing, Cole couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. He'd had a complicated relationship with sleep since his SEAL years, when the rhythms of deployment had permanently altered whatever factory settings he'd had before. Most nights he managed. Some nights, he lay in the dark and ran problems, which was less restful than sleeping, but at least productive. He ran the problem. Hollowell would arrive at the hearing with lawyers. He had the support of at least 2 planning commissioners, possibly 3. Marcus had heard through a contact on the county payroll that the vote before the article was a likely approval. The article changed that calculation, but by how much was impossible to predict. Public opinion and commission votes weren't the same thing, and commissioners who had taken support from a developer had their own calculations to make. Was going to testify. She'd told Cole this 3 days ago, with the same flat certainty she'd used to say, I'm not selling, and document everything. She was going to the microphone, and she was going to say what she knew, and Cole had not attempted to talk her out of it or into it, because it was not his call, and he already knew, from everything he'd seen of this woman over the past 3 weeks, outcome of that decision was not in doubt. What he thought about, lying in the dark, was the room. The specific social physics of a public meeting in a small town. The way people moved in groups toward power when power felt stable, away from it when power felt uncertain. 60 people at Patsy's diner had looked away on a Tuesday morning. Some of those same people might be at Municipal Hall tomorrow. He didn't know if they'd look away again. He thought they might not. The article would help, but articles and action were different things. And sitting in Municipal Hall and raising your hand against the interests of a man who spent 14 months buying the street you lived on, that required a kind of courage that was different from the kind that happened in a moment. It required the courage that held when there was time to think about it and decide not to. He got up at 5:30 and made coffee and took it to the back porch. The sky was the particular pre-dawn blue of a cold, clear morning, the stars still out at the edges, the horizon beginning to separate from the dark in the east. Ranger came out with him and sat against his leg. The cold was serious, the kind that made the inside of your nose feel tight and put your breath in small clouds. Cole put his hand on the dog's shoulder. He thought about what he'd told himself 3 years ago when he'd left the Navy and bought the garage, that his most significant operations were behind him, that the life ahead was smaller and quieter, and that smaller and quieter was what Mia needed and what he had chosen. He hadn't been wrong exactly. He'd been incomplete. The smaller, quieter life had turned out to contain its own version of the thing he'd actually been good at, not the tactics or the physical execution, the core of it, but which was the willingness to stand in a bad situation and not look away. He'd thought that part of him was retired. He looked at Foundry Street in the pre-dawn dark. The sodium lamp at the corner, 3 houses down, Lena's porch light. It wasn't retired. It had just been waiting for something worth standing for. Ranger's tail moved once, slow against the porch boards. Yeah, Cole said quietly. Let's go. It was at the Courage by 6 hits, running through the day's appointments and rescheduling 2 of them to the following week. He called the customers personally, rather than texting. It was more work and also more honest, and he'd found that people responded better to inconvenient news when it came with a voice behind it. 7:15. Mia came into the garage, in her school clothes, with her backpack, and her hair still partly unbrushed in the back, which she was capable of addressing herself, but occasionally forgot to. And she stood in the bay door and looked at him with the direct assessment that he'd been receiving from her for 9 years. "You're nervous," she said. "I'm preparing," he said. "That's not different from nervous." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you rescheduled, Mr. Hawkins." "You never reschedule, Mr. Hawkins." Put down the invoice he'd been holding and crouched so he was at her level, which he didn't do often, not because he was averse to it, but because she'd started finding it slightly patronizing around the time she turned 8, and he'd adjusted. Today, she didn't seem to mind. "There's a meeting today," he said. "An important one. For Lena, the house thing." He'd told her a version of it enough to explain why he'd been spending time with Lena, why Ranger walked with her, why things on Foundry Street had felt different recently. All of it. She was 9. The house thing, he confirmed. "Is she going to keep her house?" "I think so." "You think or you know?" He looked at her. "I think. I hope. I'm trying." She considered this with her dark eyes and her crooked in-the-back hair and her 9-year-old brain that processed things at a speed that still occasionally surprised him. "'Kay," she said. "That's enough." She kissed the top of his head, a recent development that she'd initiated, and he'd accepted without comment, because commenting on it would have made it self-conscious, and walked to the end of the driveway for the bus. Cole stayed crouched in the bay for a moment after she'd gone. "That's enough," he stood up. The article went live at 6:00 on the Courier's website. Okafor had texted Lena the night before to let her know, and Lena had texted Cole, and Cole had read it at 6:23, standing at his kitchen counter, with his second cup of coffee. It was thorough. It was sourced. It was the kind of piece that took 8 months of background and 3 weeks of specific information and 3 weeks of specific information and assembled them into something that moved in a clear line from the first paragraph to the last, without room for the kind of ambiguity that allowed powerful people to dismiss it as speculation. It named Grant Hollowell by name. It described the acquisition pattern with the supporting property records. Described the pressure campaign in careful documented terms. Described the accident 7 years ago, the Caulfield connection to Hollowell, the discrepancies between the field sobriety reading and the official record. Yes, it's the missing witness statement with the photocopy's contents described, and the document's existence confirmed by a source it described as a former county administrative employee. It named the attorney who had represented Lena at the settlement, noting that the Bar Association had been contacted for comment. Quoted Dolores Vaughn by name. Her account was 2 paragraphs specific, clear, and devastating in the particular way of an ordinary person describing an ordinary thing they had witnessed and reported and been ignored about for 7 years. Quoted Lena in the second-to-last paragraph. "I accepted a settlement from a man who had altered the evidence," she said. "I accepted it because I was told the evidence didn't support anything stronger. I know what the evidence actually showed. What I want is for other people to know it too." Cole read it twice. Then he called Lena. "I read it," he said. "So did 200 other people in the last hour," she said. Her voice was different than it had been for the past 3 weeks, not lighter exactly, but less compressed. Like something that had been held under pressure had been allowed to take up its actual space. "I've had 12 people I barely know call me this morning. What are they saying? That they didn't know, that they're coming to the hearing." She paused. "Cole, there are people coming to this hearing who have never been to a town meeting in their lives." He said nothing. He was looking at the kitchen window Foundry Street, the early morning, the sodium lamp off now in the daylight. "Marcus called," Lena said. "Breyer moved last night. She can't tell us details, but she told Marcus that an inquiry has been formally opened into the accident file." Cole let that land. "That's separate from the hearing," he said. "But it means Hollowell walks into that room today knowing it's open." She paused. "He doesn't control the story anymore. He's going to try," Cole said. "Let him." He heard something in her voice that he hadn't heard before, not aggression, not the performance of confidence. The real thing, underneath. The version that doesn't need volume because it knows its own weight. "I'll meet you there," he said. "Mia's in school. I'll bring Ranger." You don't have to bring Ranger for me. I'm not bringing him for you, Cole said. I'm bringing him because he's mine and he goes where I go. A brief pause. Okay, she said. Warmth in it. Then both of you. He hung up and looked at the dog, who was watching him from the doorway with alert stillness of a working animal who understood tone even when he couldn't follow words. Let's go, Cole said. Ranger stood. The morning was cold and clear, and Foundry Street was quiet, and in 3 hours Municipal Hall was going to be anything but he and Cole Brennan, mechanic, father, former SEAL, Skeet, the man who had stood up in a diner on a Tuesday morning because 60 people had decided not to walk to his truck with his dog beside him and drove toward the thing that needed to be done. Parking lot at Raven Creek Municipal Hall had never been full in living memory. It was full by 9:40 a.m. Cole pulled his truck into the last open spot at the far edge of the lot, next to a rusted Dodge that belonged to someone he didn't recognize, and sat for a moment looking at the building. Municipal Hall was a single-story brick structure from the early 1970s that had been designed for utility rather than dignity flat roof, aluminum-framed windows, a handicapped ramp that had been added as an afterthought in the mid-90s, and was, Cole had noted the first time he'd seen it, too steep by about 4 degrees, the same problem as Lena's. Parking lot held maybe 60 vehicles, if people were cooperative about it. Today, people had parked on the grass verge, along the road, and on the shoulder for 100 yards in both directions. Ranger dropped out of the truck and shook himself once, the full-body shake of a dog recalibrating from vehicle stillness to whatever came next. Cole looked at the crowd moving toward the entrance. He recognized some of them. The man from the hardware store. The woman who ran the post office. 2 of the regulars from Patsy's Counterstools men who had been sitting there the morning of the incident and had found interesting things to look at. They were walking toward the building, with the particular purposeful momentum of people who had made a decision and were not second-guessing it, and Cole thought about what it had taken the article. The weeks of information moving through some small town. The way information always moved in small towns, the specific tipping point where looking away became harder than showing up. He walked toward the entrance with Ranger at his left leg. Marcus was waiting outside the door in civilian clothes. He was off duty, which was a deliberate choice Cole understood without Marcus explaining it. He was here as a person today, not as a representative of the department whose accident report was currently under formal inquiry by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. How many inside? Cole said. Standing room as of 10 minutes ago, Marcus said. Commission expected maybe 40. I'd put it at over 120 right now. Hollowell arrived 20 minutes ago. 3 lawyers, 2 of his property people, and a planning consultant I've seen at 2 other hearings. Marcus paused. He read the article. How do you know? Because he arrived 20 minutes early, and he's been on his phone since he sat down. Cole looked at the entrance. Lena's already inside, Marcus said. She got here at 9. Cole went in. The main hearing room was designed for a commission meeting, a public assembly, a raised dais, with 5 commissioner seats along the front, a lectern for public comment, and rows of folding chairs that had been set up for the expected audience, and were now substantially inadequate. People were standing along both walls and across the back. The room had the specific air quality of too many people in an enclosed space. The temperature already climbed from the building's aged HVAC system and the combined body heat of a crowd that had not been expected. Cole found Lena near the front left, positioned where she had clear sight lines to the commission dais and clear access to the lectern aisle. She was in a dark coat he hadn't seen before, her notebook open on her lap, a pen clipped to the cover the way she always had it. She looked up when he arrived. She looked at the room, then at Cole. I didn't know, she said quietly, that they'd come? This many. She looked at the faces, neighbors, strangers, people she'd passed on the street for 2 years and exchanged nods with and knew by their cars rather than their names. They were paying attention. Some of them weren't, Cole said honestly. Until now, this Ranger settled beside her chair, the same position he'd taken a dozen times over the past 3 weeks, pressed lightly against the wheel, present without demanding anything. Lena's hand went to his shoulder, without her. Looking down, automatic now, the gesture of two creatures who had established their understanding of each other. Cole took a position standing along the left wall, where he had sight lines to the dais. The lectern, he sat the entrance, Fupsk, and where Hollowell was sitting across the room. Hollowell was in the third row on the right side, with his legal team arranged around him, the way legal teams arrange themselves, creating a physical buffer that was also a visual declaration of resources. He was in a dark suit that cost more than Cole's monthly garage revenue, and was looking at his phone with the focused concentration of someone managing multiple conversations simultaneously. He hadn't looked at the room yet, or had looked at it and decided not to keep looking, which was its own kind of information. Cole studied him for about 30 seconds, the way he'd studied people in briefing photographs before operations, looking for the thing beneath the presentation. What he saw was a man who was not panicking, which Cole respected even in an adversary, but whose jaw was carrying tension that his posture was working to counteract. A man who had walked in expecting to manage a process, and was now, without showing it overtly, managing a situation. There was a difference. Hollowell knew there was a difference. One of his lawyers leaned in and said something. Hollowell nodded without looking up from his phone. 10:00 a.m. The commission chair, a heavy-set man named Donald Farr, whom Cole had seen but spoken to, called the meeting to order with a gavel that seemed surprised by how much noise it was expected to cut through. Took 2 attempts. The formal presentation of the rezoning application ran 40 minutes and was delivered by Hollowell's planning consultant, with the polished fluency of someone who had stood in front of planning commissions across the state and understood that. Clarity and confidence, presented together, created an impression of inevitability that was sometimes more persuasive than the actual merits. The consultant had maps. He had economic projections. He had a rendering of the proposed development, a mixed commercial and residential complex that was rendering, but clean and modern and generically attractive in the way that development renderings always were, presenting the future as a place where nothing was complicated and parking was abundant. No. Cole watched the commission while the consultant talked. 3 of the 5 commissioners had the body language of people listening to a presentation. They'd already decided to support the specific lean back, an occasional nod of someone in confirmation mode rather than evaluation mode. Was taking notes with the focused attention of genuine engagement. The 5th, a younger woman, on the far left of the dais, whom Cole didn't know was looking at the room, rather than the consultant, reading the crowd the way a person read a room when they understood that the room was part of the information. When public comment opened, 43 people signed the sheet. The first 7 were routine 2, in favor of the development, citing economic argument. 5 opposed, citing various concerns about traffic, neighborhood character, and the displacement of existing residents. Cole listened to all of them with the same attention. The man who owned the hardware store stood up in the 7th slot and said, in the flat and slightly awkward cadence of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say and was sticking to it regardless of performance, "Yes," intervened. "I've been on this street for 22 years and I never heard from Grant Hollowell until he wanted something from me. That's not partnership. That's acquisition." He sat down. People around him clapped. Hollowell's lead lawyer stirred but said nothing. The 15th speaker was a woman named Claire Deaver, who had lived on Foundry Street for 11 years and said she had received an offer from Meridian Property Holdings 6 months ago and had declined it and had subsequently discovered that her property tax assessment had been reviewed and revised upward by 14%, a revision she had assumed was routine until reading the article that morning. The room went audibly still when she said that. Commission Chair Farr made a note. The younger commissioner on the far left that stopped looking at the crowd and started looking at Hollowell. Hollowell was looking at his lawyer. Cole tracked all of it. The 22nd speaker was a man Cole recognized from the VFW hall, Gary Tillman, 64 years old, Vietnam-era veteran, Kind of man whose voice had the specific register of someone who had lost patience with diplomacy sometime in the previous decade and saw no reason to reclaim it. Gary Tillman said, into the microphone, "Why a company that can't be bothered to put a real name on its registration documents is asking this commission for permission to tear down half a street." I read the article this morning like everybody else in this room. And what I read is that the man behind that company, he didn't point, but his body oriented toward Hollowell's side of the room, has been running an operation on Foundry Street that looks a lot less like development and a lot more like a squeeze. He looked at the commission. I've seen squeezes before. Different context. Same shape. You want to vote on this application after reading what's in that paper today. That's your business. But I want it on record that this room saw it and said something. He walked back to his seat. The applause lasted longer than anything before it. Hollowell leaned to his lawyer. The lawyer shook his head slightly. Lena's name was called 31st. She moved to the lectern with hurried navigation that Cole had watched her use across 3 weeks in various difficult situations. He'd intervened, and she positioned herself at the microphone and looked at the commission without looking at her notebook. She had decided not to read from it. Cole had not known that until this moment. "My name is Lena Whitaker," she said. "I've lived at 14 Foundry Street for 2 years. Before that, I lived in Nashville. Before that, I was in a rehabilitation facility for 4 months. And before that, I was in a car accident on Route 9 that was caused by a driver who was more than twice the legal blood alcohol limit." The room was completely still. "I didn't know he was more than twice the limit when I signed a settlement agreement," she said. "I was told the evidence was borderline. I was told a jury might not convict. I was told the practical choice was to settle." She paused. For effect, she was moving through something and taking the time it required. The evidence was not borderline. I know that now because a retired county clerk kept a photocopy of a document that was supposed to disappear. Because a first responding officer has been carrying the truth of what he saw that night for 7 years. Because a woman who stopped her car on the side of a road and did what ordinary citizens are supposed to do, report what they witnessed, has been waiting 7 years for someone to care that her statement was removed from the file. Someone in the back of the room made a sound, not words. Just the involuntary sound of a person absorbing something they hadn't expected. "The driver that night was Derek Caulfield," Lena said. "Is Grant Hollowell's first cousin. The attorney who represented me at the settlement had connections I was not told about. Official record of what happened to me was altered, and the altered record was used to minimize what I received in exchange for releasing the Caulfield family from further liability." She stopped. "I am not here to ask this commission to adjudicate that. There are appropriate bodies for that, and they are currently involved." Hollowell's lead lawyer stood up. "Commissioner, sit down," Farr said. Flatly, without looking at the lawyer sat, waited for the room to settle. "I'm here because the man who benefited from what was done to me 7 years ago is now asking this commission for permission to take my home," she said. "I want this commission and everyone in this room to understand that those two things are connected. That the same network of relationships that buried the truth of a Friday night on Route 9 has spent 14 months trying to pressure the remaining residents of Foundry Street into selling. That when I refused to sell, contractors stopped returning my calls. When I continued to refuse, 3 men walked into a diner on a Tuesday morning and kicked my wheelchair." She looked at the room directly now, not at the commission, at the people. 60 people were in that diner. Most of them looked away. She paused. "I understand why. Looking away is easier. It's safer. It doesn't require anything from you." The silence was absolute. "Powerful men survive because ordinary people practice looking away," she said. "They practice it until it becomes automatic, until they don't even notice they're doing it." She looked at the commission again. "I am asking this commission not to look away. I am asking the people in this room not to look away. I don't need anyone to fight my battle. I am fighting it. I have been fighting it for a long time." She picked up her notebook. "I just need people to keep their eyes open while I do." She moved back from the lectern. The room didn't applaud immediately. It sat with what she'd said for 3 full seconds, the specific silence of a space that was processing rather than reacting, and then the sound came up from the back and the sides and moved through the room like weather. Cole was looking at the commission. The younger commissioner on the far left had her hand flat on the table. Taking commissioner had set his pen down. Yes, seat. Farr was looking at Hollowell's side of the room with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd thought was settled. Hollowell was looking at the table in front of him. Yes, he didn't. Hollowell's lawyer gave a prepared statement that ran 8 minutes and addressed approximately none of what Lena had said, which was its own kind of answer to the room. It cited the economic merits of the development, the procedural legitimacy of the application process, and the separation between civil matters and zoning decisions, all of which were technically accurate and entirely beside the point of what had just happened in the room, and the room knew it. The vote came after a 30-minute closed session that felt to the 120 people sitting folding chairs and standing against the walls of Raven Creek Municipal Hall considerably longer. When the commission returned, Farr looked older than he'd looked when he'd opened the meeting. The commission has discussed the application. At length, he said. We are also aware of the reporting published this morning and the questions it raises about the applicant's conduct in relation to property owners in the affected corridor. It is the finding of this commission that the application as submitted cannot be evaluated independently of those questions. He looked at the paper in front of him. The application is tabled, pending further review. The review period is open-ended, subject to resolution of the matters currently under investigation by the appropriate authorities. He set the paper down. Commissioner Aldridge, he said, nodding to the younger commissioner, has indicated she will be requesting a formal audit of the application process and any communications between the applicant and commission members over the past 14 months. That audit will be conducted by an independent body. He looked at the room. This meeting is adjourned. The gavel came down. Hollowell stood. His lead lawyer said something immediately into his ear, and Hollowell nodded once and moved toward the exit with the purposeful pace of a man who understood that the exit was now the correct strategic position. He did not look at Lena. He did not look at Cole. He moved through the crowd with his legal team arranged around him and was out at the door before most of the room had processed that the meeting was over. Cole watched him go. He felt nothing in particular about it, not satisfaction, not the specific release of tension that movies suggested came with a clear victory. What he felt was the tired, clear-eyed assessment of a person who had been through enough to know that moments like this one were waypoints, not destinations. Hollowell was in a vehicle and on his phone before he'd reached the parking lot. His lawyers were already managing the next 48 hours. The work ahead, the TBI investigation, the inquiry into the accident file, Lena's legal challenge against the settlement, was long and unglamorous and would grind through institutional time at institutional speed. But the morning had done something that institutional processes couldn't do on their own. It had put the truth in the room in front of people who had been, for various reasons, and to various degrees practicing not to see it. It didn't undo itself easily. Marcus appeared beside him. Commissioner Aldridge wants to speak to Lena, he said. After the room clears, I'll tell her. Cole moved to where Lena was, surrounded by a small cluster of people, neighbors, and strangers in equal measure, all of them speaking to her with the specific, slightly awkward energy of people who wanted to say something meaningful and were working out what it was. She was handling it with the patience of a woman who understood that this was part of it too, the messy, imperfect human aftermath of a moment that had required other people to step out of their comfort. She looked at Cole over the shoulder of a woman who was pressing her hand. Aldridge, after. She nodded. He'd intervened. Commissioner Aldridge's name was Patricia, and she was 39 years old, the youngest member of the commission. Oh! And the one who had been watching the room rather than the consultant for most of the morning. She spoke to Lena in a side hallway, with Cole and Marcus present at Lena's request, and she was direct in the way of someone who had made a decision and was acting on it rather than warming up to it. I want to be clear about what the audit will and won't do, she said. It will look at whether any commissioner received anything of value from the applicant or his representatives during the application period. It will look at whether the application process was followed correctly. What it won't do is address the criminal and civil matters. Those go through other channels. I understand, Lena said. I also want to say Aldridge stopped. She looked at Lena with the expression of someone stepping slightly outside their professional register. What you said at the microphone. I've been on this commission for 4 years. Sat through 40-something public hearings. People don't usually say things like that. She paused. It mattered. I want you to know it mattered. Lena looked at her. Before today, about any of it. No, Aldridge said. But I've been uncomfortable with this application for 6 weeks, and I didn't look at why closely enough. I'm not entirely clean on the looking away count either. It was a hard thing to say. She said it without flinching. Was quiet for a moment. Then don't look away now, she said. That's all I'm asking anyone. The weeks that followed moved the way these things always moved, not cinematically, not in clean sequences with clear resolutions, but in the grinding institutional rhythm of investigations and legal proceedings and official letters and phone calls with attorneys. Lena hired a new lawyer. From a referral service, she found him herself. Through 3 weeks of research and 2 interviews, and his name was David Park. And he was 44 years old and had spent 15 years doing plaintiff-side civil rights work and had the specific, unhurried confidence of a person who knew how to read a case and wait for the right pressure points. He reviewed the photocopy, spoke to Edna Marsh and Dolores Van, reviewed the settlement agreement, and told Lena, in his careful and unsensational way, that she had grounds for a legal challenge to the settlement based on material misrepresentation and the suppression of evidence. How long, Lena asked. Civil litigation is long, David Park said. I won't tell you otherwise, but the strength of what you have is unusual. Usually, in cases like this, the evidence is circumstantial or degraded. What you have is a photocopy of a primary document, a living eyewitness, and a law enforcement officer who is willing to provide a sworn account. That's an unusual amount of concrete ground to stand on. Will we win? He looked at her. I think we have a very strong case. I don't make guarantees. Fair, she said. The TBI investigation was formal and closed and moved without public announcement, the way such investigations were supposed to move. I called Cole once, 6 weeks after the hearing, to tell him the investigation was active and progressed, and that she couldn't tell him more than that. He thanked her, and she hung up. The officer whose name was on the altered accident report, a man who had retired from the department 3 years earlier, was contacted by investigators. Cole didn't know what he said. He didn't need to know. The attorney who had represented Lena at the settlement received a letter from the State Bar Association notifying him of a formal inquiry into his conduct. Cole found out about this from Lena, who had found out from David Park, who had found out from through channels Cole didn't act too chickensed about. No. Grant Hollowell's Foundry Street development was not resubmitted. Cotter Cancervint, the structural inspection order against Lena's property, was dismissed 6 weeks after the hearing when the county building office, under the audit that Commissioner Aldridge had initiated, even determined that the inspection had been requested based on a complaint that could not be traced to a legitimate source. Compliance violations as against Cole's garage were closed when he submitted documentations showing the sign had been repainted and the drainage addressed. The licensing office sent a form letter confirming closure. Cole filed it in a folder and put the folder in the back of a drawer. Hollowell's remaining Raven Creek properties, the ones he'd acquired over 14 months of careful, cash-funded positioning, sat unsold for 3 months and then began moving back onto the market at slightly below what he'd paid for them. Because he was forced to sell. Because the rezoning was dead without the political infrastructure to support it. Without the rezonings and assembled properties were just properties, and holding them was carrying cost without return. Cole heard about the first sale from Marcus. He didn't say much about it. He was under a Ford Ranger, at the time the actual vehicle, The dog, and he rolled out, looked at the number Marcus showed him on his phone, and rolled back under. Okay, he said. That's it? Marcus said. What else? Marcus thought about it. I don't know. Something. He sold a property, Cole said from under the truck. I fixed a ball joint. Both things happened. Hand me the torque wrench. Marcus handed him the torque wrench. Asked, the first week of December, whether Lena was their family now. She asked it at dinner, with the direct and borderless honesty of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to pre-screen her own questions for social complexity. And Cole set his fork down and looked at his daughter, and thought about how to answer it honestly rather than conveniently. What that word means exactly, he said. Family. Mia gave him the look that she gave him when she suspected he was deflecting. It means, she said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should know better, that you go to her house a lot, and she comes here and Ranger sleeps better when we've all been in the same place. Cole looked at the dog, who was under the table pressed against Mia's feet, and thought that this was an unexpectedly precise metric for emotional state. Then I guess we're figuring it out, he said. Mia picked up her fork. She's staying for dinner on Friday, she said. Not a question. Yes, yeah, Cole said. She is. Mia nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed what they already knew and finds the adults around them occasionally slow to catch up. The dinner on Friday was not remarkable in the way that moments in stories were supposed to be remarkable. It was winter by then, genuinely cold, and Lena arrived with a bottle of wine and the information that her legal challenge had formally been filed that morning. They acknowledged, and then set aside because there was nothing more to do about it tonight, and the pasta was almost ready. Mia had decided she was going to teach Lena a card game she'd learned from a friend at school. Rules of this game were, as far as Cole could determine while cooking, either extremely complicated or entirely invented. Lena engaged with them with the same seriousness she'd applied to topographic map contour lines, and Mia was loudly delighted. Ranger was in front of the fireplace, not watching the door, watching the driveway, just lying in the warmth, with his gray muzzle on his paws, and his eyes half closed, the deep and specific rest of an animal who had decided the current situation required nothing from him. Cole stood at the stove and looked at the room, his daughter laughing at the table, explaining rules she was possibly making up in real time. Lena engaged and focused and present in the way she was when she found something genuinely interesting. Ranger's slow breathing in front of the fire, the cold outside the windows and the warmth inside them. He had come back from his SEAL years with the private conviction that the most significant things he would ever do were behind him. The life ahead was maintenance of a child, of a property, of a version what was essential, that had been stripped down to what was essential and had no interest in being more than that. He had not been wrong about the stripping down. He had been wrong about what was on the other side of it. The other side of it was this kitchen, this table, these people, and the specific knowledge carried now, not like weight but like something that had finally found its correct place, that standing beside someone while they fought for themselves was not a lesser version of courage. It was the version that mattered, the version that lasted, the version that didn't require a mission briefing or a uniform or a target to be the thing that needed doing. Lena looked up from the card game and caught him looking. He didn't look away. She held his gaze for a moment with the direct, clear-eyed attention she brought to everything, and then the corner of her mouth moved in the way that had been building toward a full smile for 3 weeks, and it finally arrived, not the near miss, the actual thing, unreserved and unguarded, in a way he hadn't seen her be before. He turned back to the stove. The pasta needed attention. Spring came to Raven Creek the way it always did gradually, and then suddenly, the cold breaking over the course of 2 weeks in March, until the morning came when you went outside, and something in the air was different, softer, carrying a smell that had been absent for months. Lena's kitchen garden was going back in. Cole had built her 2 additional raised beds, over the winter better dimensions than the original ones, planned properly, at the height that worked, and Mia had appointed herself the authority, on which seeds went where, a role she took seriously enough to have consulted 3 separate online sources and a library book. The sign above the garage bays had fresh paint again. Cole had repainted it over a weekend in February, not because the first coat had needed it yet, but because the first coat had been done under obligation, and this one was done because he felt like it, which was a different thing entirely. Foundry Street was quieter than it had been during the 14 months of Hollow's campaign, and would probably be quieter still for a while. Particular quiet of a street that had been through something, was still processing what that meant for the version of itself that came next. Marcus came by the garage on a Tuesday in April, which had become a loose habit coffee. 20 minutes, whatever was happening. He sat on the stools Cole kept near the workbench for people who wanted to talk while he worked, and he held his and said nothing. For a moment, yes, in the comfortable way of a friendship that had reached the point where silence was part of the available register. Breyer called me, he said finally. Cole kept working. Formal action on the accident file, Marcus said. Can't tell you the specifics, but it's moving. Okay, Cole. Yeah. I've been carrying that for 7 years, Marcus said. What I saw on that field test and what ended up in the file. Told myself I misread it. I told myself the senior officer had more information. He stopped. I talked myself into a lot of things I didn't actually believe. Cole set down the tool he was holding and turned to look at him. Marcus was looking at his coffee cup. His jaw was working slightly, the movement of a person choosing words carefully. You didn't look away when it mattered, Cole said. Last October, when it mattered. Took me 7 years. Took the town 20 minutes, Cole said, at the diner. And most of them figured it out eventually. He picked up the tool again. That's how it usually works. Marcus was quiet. You told the truth when it counted, Cole said. That's what I've got. Marcus nodded, drank his coffee. After a while, he left. Cole went back to the engine he'd been rebuilding. Ranger came from wherever he'd been and settled in the corner of the bay, in the morning light that came through the open door, the gray in his muzzle catching the sun, his eyes half closed. The street outside was ordinary and bright. Somewhere 3 doors down, a woman was deciding which seeds went in the east bed first, and arguing about it cheerfully with a 9-year-old who had done her research. Cole worked. The morning was quiet, and the light was good, and the engine was coming apart cleanly under his hands, each component revealing the next, and he thought not for the first time. With the clarity that sometimes arrived without announcement that the life he had wanted when he came back from the wars was exactly this. A version of it. Not a substitute for something better. This precisely and completely the work. The light, the people 3 doors down, the dog in the corner, the sound of Foundry Street going about its morning like a place that had decided what it was. He'd thought quieter meant smaller. He'd been wrong about that. The biggest things in a life rarely announced themselves. They arrived in diners, on Tuesday mornings, in the shape of a wheelchair kicked sideways by a man who expected the room to look away. They lived in the decision made in a fraction of a second, without ceremony or calculation, to stand up instead. Was all it had ever taken. That was, he understood now, everything. The most courageous thing a person can do is not the thing done in a moment of crisis. It is the quiet, daily decision to stand beside someone the world has decided to overlook, and to keep standing there, note, until the world reconsiders.